So today I'm going to talk to you about physical activity, which was the task, but also sedentary behavior. And I think particularly in the older adults, that's emerging as a very important issue, because if we can't get them to do physical activity, they're the group least likely to meet our physical activity guidelines. Can we at least get them out of the chair? And that whole process of getting out of the chair is related to frailty and mortality. So can we change that? And then obviously mobility, as the others have talked about, and then falls are issues related to moving in older adults that we think is really important. So to start with the physical activity assessment, as we've talked already about how objective are our objective measures, and I actually liked the CDC presentation on this at ACSM last summer, where they said stop using the word objective. It's sensor measures and it's self-report, because how we slice the data is not objective. We make very biased decisions on how we slice it. So let's talk about sensors and self-report. So as you can see here in our older adults, average age of our participants in some of our studies is 82. So we have many 90-year-olds going up through 100. And if you apply the traditional cut points here, these folks are doing a 400-meter walk test. So we definitely knew that they were walking. And essentially you can see the traditional cut points, and even some of the lower cut points proposed, would not give an older adult credit for doing this 400-meter walk. They wouldn't be seen to be doing a physical activity. And that's really important to me, because the main thing I do is intervene with older adults, and I want to know that I'm assessing the change in behavior that I'm trying to instigate. So what's been going on in our field? So for example, Andrea LaCroix in her OPATCH study did a very well-designed calibration study in the lab. They had over 200 women come in. They did various types of testings, and they decided to use an approach to develop new cut points. Now what's great about this sample is it was a subsample of a larger 6,000 women cohort, and I'll show you some of how they've actually been using that data related to falls. So as we've already heard, we use the SenseCam, hip accelerometer. The GPS is also one on the same belt on the hip, and then the wrist accelerometer overnight. And as I mentioned yesterday, we've been developing our algorithms. We do a feature extraction. We use a random forest at the next level, and then we do this hidden Markov modeling time smoothing. So I'll take a couple of seconds to take you through this, because I mentioned it yesterday, but here you can actually just see the differences. So the first data set we had was protocolized data. We got people to do specific activities in very random orders with various amounts of stopping and starting in between. So in that situation, when we develop an algorithm based on that data, it has really high performance. We can, across all the different behaviors, and this is an example, this is just the hip accelerometer data at the moment that I'm talking about. So we can have accuracy of 93%. And then we had a group of younger cyclists. We could also predict their behaviors very well. And then we had a group of older women. So when we train it on each of these groups, all of them perform. But if I then say my algorithm from the protocol data and apply that to the older women, then it doesn't work as well. So I've lost 13% of my accuracy. So that's, I think, one of the questions that we're saying when somebody said, well, I'm missing 15% of the data, or I'm losing 30% of my accuracy. What is the consequences of that? Are we as measurement folks just getting too uptight about these small differences? But what that really also means to me is we have to be very careful. And this, as I say, this was outside of the lab protocolized data, and so if I'd done this in the lab, I think there would be even bigger differences, and some studies have shown that. So I'm just very nervous about taking something developed in the lab and applying it to then a free living cohort like the Women's Health Initiative data that we have. So here's what we've been doing. This is just a classifier for walking minutes. As I said here, you can see these other behaviors that we've been working on as well, riding in a vehicle, sitting and standing, all from hip-worn accelerometers. So this is just focusing on the walking. So when we have the ground truth, we're able to tell by a series of images that somebody is walking. So for example, we recorded 28 minutes of walking in the day from these various folks. And so if I apply the cut point, it's only picking up 12 minutes because not all this walking is moderate vigorous. There was also colleagues Van Heesen developed an algorithm both for the hip and for the wrist in the laboratory, and it wasn't necessarily developed for older folks. But actually, that worked pretty well in our free living data. So it did, transfer. And when you look at his algorithm also on the wrist, both of these are performing pretty well, hip and wrist. So he's got some consistency there. We then developed our classifier, and we're having a closer association. We're looking at walking and we're matching the walking, and this is at the hip. A little bit less on the wrist. We're having a little bit less ability to do that. And this is just the reminder that I mentioned to our inner group yesterday. Some people are going into the ActiLife software, pressing apply cut points to wrist data, and they're actually using the hip cut points on the wrist data. And so that's what happens. You get absolute garbage. But unfortunately, that's sort of what sometimes happens. So then when we then apply these, so these algorithms were developed on the older women, and when we then apply them to a different set of older women, this was over 300 older women that we collected as part of our NCI Trek Institute. So here's what we get, the percent of the population meeting the guidelines by method. So the cut points, this was still a fairly active population, even though the average age was over 55. 20% of the population would be meeting 150-minute-a-week guidelines here. When you use the GGIR, again, as it showed us in the previous one, it's a little bit more. And then obviously our walking algorithm picks up more of the population are actually walking for 150 minutes a week. So we have to think about, is that the guidelines we want, and what's the relationship between the outcomes? But one of the things I really wanted to show here is, remember how I mentioned that the wrist algorithm, the lab algorithm was performing very well in our data set. Remember that data set with the sense camera is collected in free living, but it's only when we have clean annotations that we're matching it. So in some ways it's still clean data. This is completely messy data. There is no annotation. So we don't have the ground truth. I can't tell you which of one of these is correct, but it's totally, there's no data missing. There's no data sliced off of it. So it is then harder to predict. So that's when I see that the lab algorithm is falling down. So like I showed you, our hip algorithm worked well, and it didn't work so well on the wrist. So I'm not surprised to see the slight difference. And this is just if it's on the wrist, but the same matched hours as worn on the hip. And what I'm seeing here is that the wrist algorithm is picking up much more movement, the lab-based one, than what they had predicted. So I'm guessing that, to me, this is fine. It's picking up that somebody probably is moving, but it's not necessarily the moderate vigorous that algorithm was designed to do. So I think we just have to be careful of algorithms developed in the lab. One of the other things that I'm excited about, too, is that when you compare our machine learned algorithms for walking with self-reported physical activity data, for example, from the IPAC, that relationship, they're much closer than what we've seen. We've seen such disparities between the cut points and the self-report. So hopefully we don't have to throw away all this epidemiological evidence we have from self-report, because saying that this was objective and the truth, it isn't. Okay, so then, we developed these algorithms on a subset of women from these interventions. They actually weren't eligible for the intervention for reasons not related to physical activity, but this is breast cancer survivors. So we developed our algorithm in the age group that matched these women, and this is a 4-group randomized controlled trial. So as you see, if we actually applied the 1952 cut point to MVPA, this is the change that you'd see over time. And in fact, these women did increase their walking, and those in these are the 2 control conditions, reduce their walking over time. So to me, again, this is this point of assessing walking in an intervention. And again, these women were all postmenopausal breast cancer survivors. They're not able to reach these MVPA. So then what happens when we relate this to insulin? So the insulin relationship for every 30-minute unit, so every 30-minute increase in physical activity does impact insulin to a higher degree. It's an 18% change in insulin. Compared to the walking, which is of all intensities, is only a 4% change. But only 3% of the women achieve this change versus 19 achieving it in the walking. So if you're saying what's the impact on public health, small change across a bigger population is potentially one approach we can think about. So as I said, we had developed these algorithms particularly for that breast cancer cohort. We collected some more data in older women and then really developed an older women classifier. And then on a totally different data set, this was on our MyPark data set, we then said, okay, we've developed this classifier. It's got the accuracy like some of our others had. We picked these 220 women from this study. We just took the men away. That was the only thing we did here. And then we had a 400-meter walk test on them. So it had 86% accuracy in identifying that walk test. And we also had our GPS data. So we were able to also confirm that our machine learned algorithms were correctly assessing vehicle and walking compared to GPS data and stationary time. So again, this was something that, someone said to me, I just don't believe that you can get vehicle time from a hip-borne accelerometer. I said, well, what can I do to make you believe that? Okay, compare it to some GPS data. Okay, done it, okay? That's fine, I don't mind. Just keep telling me, don't believe it, but tell me what would help you believe it as well. And again, we saw big differences if we use these methods versus a traditional cut point for the over time, the changes. So I think what's important about this is, we've got these data sets, the OPATCH and the WHS large data sets with chronic disease outcomes and mortality that we can now start applying these methods to. So how is it going to affect potentially our approach to the physical activity guidelines? And possibly not this new 2018, but maybe the next ones. So talk about physical activity interventions in older adults. So the type of work I do is these multi-level cluster randomized controlled trials. So basically, we know that, I can convince somebody to go for a walk potentially through pedometers and counseling, but they're less likely to keep doing it if they're doing it on their own. And also, if they're going to do it in a very poor environment, I'm sending them out to an unsafe environment. So our studies work on all these things. We train older adults to lead these walking groups, to motivate their other older adult companions. We do it in senior centers and retirement communities. We also train them to become community advocates. And they go out and they change the timing on the crosswalk. They get access points cleaned up. That's how I approach physical activity. And as you can see from our study in the retirement community, we're able to get, good increases in physical activity. They don't necessarily stay like all our intervention trials, but I think what's particularly important in our older adults is this is the control group, and this is particularly the men in the control group. There's an awful lot of decline that's happening. So what I see here is that we return people in the intervention group to baseline after a year, but that basically prevented a year of decline, which I think is also important. So then, considering this multi-level model, what would this look like as a technology solution? So, if you had an app that focused both on walking and walkability, you'd be tracking your walk, you'd be rating your community, making sure that goes out to the city in some way, you'd be meeting other walkers, you'd meet other advocates, you'd be able to map your data, train it. You'd go to training where you could learn about leading group walks or doing community advocacy, and we'd keep pushing back to you to say, have you done these things, these goals you're doing? So this is, partly where I want to go, because I'm definitely interested in dissemination, right? Reaching a larger group. If I'm just focusing on these settings, I'm not reaching many people. But then what's missing? These amazing leaders that we trained who actually do this, the in-person part. Tell me which app is going to dress up as Elvis to motivate their group. Honestly, we love working with these folks. They're the best, right? So my question is, can we use technology in interventions for older adults? So there's not much published in the literature, but there are definitely a lot of pilot studies coming out. Fitbit has been used in older adults. There's other things out of Stanford and Berkeley that are trying to promote walking and community assessments. I don't know if it's really going to help with implementation. I think it can help you reach a larger amount, but is it really going to help with sustainability? And I think what we've learned from our group, and there are reviews showing it in older adults, the most important things for older adults for physical activity is the social. So how can we get that? And I don't think it's leveraging Facebook, because I think it's about the in-person social. We had some experience a number of years ago trying to do ecological momentary assessment with older adults. So we'd send them a message. I taught them how to use, and this was before the smartphone. So I taught them how to text and respond, and they got it. They respond, but then we'd send out a message. They wouldn't respond to it, and then you sent out the next message, and they responded to the first. So if our data set wasn't set up to be flexible to that, it got garbage. And then I'm getting messages like, "Thanks for asking, good night." And I'm like, these people did not realize this was coming from a computer, So, you got to do it, and then it opens your mind to what's actually going on. And then for our one of our intervention trials, we want our leaders of the program to sort of track attendance and other things. So we provided them with a tablet to do that. So we designed it specifically for them. But it's still a struggle for them to use at times. And when there is some sort of technical glitch, it just stops them using it. And we're really having to go in and still in person help them to do things. So it's not a solution yet. I wanted to mention, so for example, for some outcomes, we know that moderate vigorous physical activity is the outcome that we need to reach. So if you're trying to get cognitive change, you need to get increased blood flow, therefore you need to do higher levels of physical activity. Now we can do that in the laboratory, but we haven't yet shown that we can do this in free living. So Zvinka, who's here, I don't know, Zvinka, do you want to stand up? Okay, Zvinka's just in the back there, so you guys can speak to her afterwards about this. So she's got a K award, and she's, having reviewed the different devices, she's using a Mio fuse that will monitor their heart rate, and that's what she's trying to find out is, can she get them to adhere to a heart rate tailored guideline for physical activity. And then she's testing all the cognitive and cerebral outcomes as well. So going to sedentary behavior, as I mentioned already, the cut points that we use on the hip accelerometer are basically correctly classifying sitting, because all sitting falls under that cut point, but it's misclassifying if you're standing, and again, about 25% of our vehicle time gets misclassified as not sitting. So again, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is not the hip accelerometer's fault, it's the cut point fault. So basically, we've been using the ActiPower, which is on the thigh, and that has pretty good validity, to say, okay, if we use that as our ground truth, that it's correctly getting the posture, from these different signals we still see on the hip data, can we actually do better? And again, when you, as I mentioned with the kids' data yesterday, when you look at the total day, the two instruments look pretty good together. But this is the ActiPower, and it's telling us 30-minute bouts of sitting. And so the GTX, the normal cut points, really underestimate these bouts. And what we've done is created a machine-learned algorithm on the hip that really is starting to match what the ActiPal is doing. So, these big trials like the WHI can't go back and just get a bunch of ActiPal data to improve their outcomes. What can we do with our techniques to improve them now? And then some of the next steps in the assessment, again, is applying it to these big data sets. And for me, again, what's so important is this is just in a small sample where we had insulin on these older women. We're seeing after controlling for physical activity and BMI that just that sit-to-stand transition is making a difference in their insulin. So again, there's so much more work to be done to sort of demonstrate this. But I just think it's that public health approach of, can we make small differences that people can do, that they actually do, to help with their health? And that's why I think changing the sitting is one of those. So to go to sensory behavior interventions, this is some of the work that we've also been doing. So we take the data from the ActivePal and we feed it back. And we just do printouts of these because the ActivePal is not yet connected to a website or a phone system. And we didn't take what the ActivePal have done as the graphs because they were really useless for intervention. We created a macro that enabled us to give this feedback. So what this is, when we sit with a participant, we're saying, okay, you've got to avoid the red. These are the times that you're sitting, so let's avoid the red. So again, there was some testing of just even how to present these graphs, the coloring and things like that. So all that was done. So when we sort of say, well, we've got great data, how we present it to people is so important because how we present it affects their ability and motivation. So what we see when we do studies of this, if you do a traditional physical activity study, you can increase physical activity, but you really don't reduce much sedentary time. And in fact, Melissa Wick-Glover was saying in her church study that they had an increase in sitting time in their older adults. They went and did physical activity and they had to sit for longer during the day because of it. So if you actually do these very focused interventions on sedentary behavior, people don't move. We're asking them, we're not saying go do physical activity, we're saying get out your chair and stand up more. So they can reduce their sitting time by like 2 hours. So that's what's really important for us as well. So let's make sure that the intervention message is right for the right behavior. So that's really important. And the two are not the same. So others have been working on this. Dori Rosenberg has been did a pilot test with the Pivotal, showing that helped decrease sedentary time in a small pilot. But then when she tried to use it in her R21, it wasn't scaling, so they've turned to the jawbone. I know Jack Rajeski is doing some work with the phone app on non-exercise intervention, not necessarily sedentary behavior. We did some focus groups, and I'm glad our PhD student Michelle is here, and this is what she's focusing on for her thesis, is we did some focus groups around the technology and with the older adults saying what would help you reduce your sitting time, what technologies, and we worked with our human-computer interaction person to actually have a more interactive focus group than what might be normal for us health researchers. And what they said is they still need a person to hold me accountable. They do want to know there's somebody on the end of that system that you're pushing them. And they really wanted these wearables to be flexible and fashionable. So again, just back to the ActivePal, when I spoke to the company recently, I was asking about their new Bluetooth version of the ActivePal because I thought maybe we could be using that because it can connect to a phone. But they were saying, yeah, but the connectivity's not that great, so we're losing some data and it's affecting the battery life. So I think even these great companies, we've got to be careful. Like the ActivePal maybe should just remain a good measurement tool and not necessarily push it too much into the real-time intervention. So just to quickly look at mobility and falls, so this is work by Jeff Kay up in Oregon. So they have everything in the home monitored. I absolutely love it. And so they can see if somebody's left the home, if they're on the computer, does their computer behavior change, etc. And so that's really important. And I also like the way he's presenting this data and some of the implications for continuous monitoring. So they're saying, with the continuous monitoring, not only can we reduce the sample sizes, but for example, if we're doing medication trials, we can see very quickly whether somebody is having adverse effects, and perhaps adverse effects that aren't the ones that you have in your side effects and your consent form, but things like, okay, they're not going out for the morning paper anymore, etc. So I'm really excited about what continuous monitoring can do to our designs as well. As Sai showed, the SenseCam can also collect some of these very important activities of daily living. So I don't think you could necessarily have the SenseCam on very large population groups, but I think it's great as a validation tool, or potentially even for an intervention tool. You can see so much into somebody's life through these images. So a counselor could potentially talk through some of the issues. I was asked to talk about falls detection as well. oh my goodness, this is a whole talk on its own. And so you can see there's been so many studies of all different places to try and detect falls, and so there's a lot of reviews on this as well. But when you actually then talk to the older adults, none of them have really been designed necessarily for older adults. And all the sort of falls they're doing are usually in the lab and sort of very artificial. And then when they have tried to test these in the real world, there are an awful lot of false alarms. So that's the struggle. And I know folks here are using cameras to try and detect balance and falls and sitting behavior. So there's lots of sort of other ways. And that's not an image. It's the spectrum that helps tell you what's going on. Okay. So back to falls. And or staying with falls, and actually on some epidemiological outcomes. So with the new cut points that they designed for the OPATCH study, they're basically looking at quartiles of physical activity. So normally what we see with physical activity in falls is kind of this U shape. So those that aren't being active are likely to have a fall, and those that are being very active are likely to have a fall. And that's what this data shows, that's not the case, that those that are the most active aren't more likely to have a fall outcome. And what they're able to show is if you haven't had a fall, then it doesn't matter, the physical activity is not a risk for you. But if you have had falls, again, maybe you're seeing this more U-shaped relationship as well. So again, this data, this new way of processing this data in these large epi cohorts with important outcomes is here. It's happening. So then just to finish, I want to talk to you about Lifespace. So Lifespace has been shown to be related to mortality as well. So that's basically, have you left your bedroom? Have you left your house? Have you left your porch? Have you left your garden? Have you left your neighborhood? So where are you going? Or are you really homebound? So what we did in our physical activity intervention trial was had both GPS and accelerometer on our older adults, and then created these life spaces. So we had home, campus, neighborhood, and beyond the neighborhood, because they were in these retirement community campuses. So what you can see over time is that all the groups are doing less physical activity in their home as a consequence of our intervention, doing a lot more activity on campus. But it's really only the men that were then taking their walking out into their neighborhood. So again, I think just having these tools, both the GPS and accelerometer, can get us to different outcomes in these clinical trials, not just physical activity, but this life space. So I'm going to show you a little animation of this. Okay, remind me what I got to do here. Okay, so what you can see up here is not much going on. So the tiny little spots are accelerometer counts of inactivity. The yellows when they're moving a little bit light activity, and the orange, oh there is one, is when there is some activity. So this is baseline. Not a lot going on. Okay, we'll stop that there then. Okay, how's my driving? Okay. Okay, so this is then at 3 months. Lots of orange in the neighborhood. Oh, someone went for a walk. We actually did a intervention here. We cleaned up the car park because they had cars were parking over the sidewalk. So we did an advocacy project and changed it. So I could sit and watch this all day. So you can really see that people are getting outside of their community. They're going into the neighborhood. This sort of data, so when we think about how we present data, it's very important because, I'm all about the statistical tests and this visualization stuff, it's just going to, make me think I've done a greater job than I have. That's why I want to look at it all day long. There's another one out this way. This is so cool. Anyway, when we show this to our transportation agency, they're really excited. So now they're talking to us about having GPS data modeled in their transportation plans and things like that. So it's changed the relationship that we have with them because they're really excited by this type of animation. So, important. So to finish, what are the key points, I think? Again, as I said already, don't blame the device, check the data processing methods. We really need these standardized, free-living, and potentially protocolized validation data sets, because there are some things you can only do in certain situations. And this is just to emphasize the amount of, this is the number of people we currently have with SenseCam data and the number of days. So a data set like this that has quite a bit of diversity too could be used as one of those benchmarks that we talked about. But what our computer scientists have very much explained to us is this data needs to be publicly available, and that's partly why we had partnered with Camille to try and work through that. So we definitely have had 2 examples now with the IRB where we've asked people to give their permission for their data to be shared, and they were willing to do that. So the measurement precision, I think, is really important for my interventions, but also for these epidemiological studies. And again, most of these are in older adults now, but the data can still be interpreted in different ways. So for example, recently in the Lancet, I think, was if you sit for 8 hours a day, 1 hour of physical activity will offset that 8 hours of sitting. Yeah, because we can all get 1 hour of physical activity in the day. So, there are different ways of interpreting that data. Does technology improve the physical activity experience for older adults? My folks are like their pedometers. They like that they go walking with each other. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put technology into that space. And for me, the usability issues would definitely be more important with older adults. If you have a glitch, if it's not ready, and you have a glitch, it's going to lead to so many phone calls that they're trying to work out what's gone wrong with their device that you've given them. So, I mean, it's always wonderful to talk to older adults, but it becomes a headache too. So thanks very much. A really small selection of our team are here from the back as well. Lindsay, Eileen, Kelsey, and Kalisa. And what we do is we're so privileged to work with these older folks because they're just the best. But it really is, we're a huge village to get it done. Thank you.